Welcome to Faith Wonders, where real stories of faith and miracles come alive from around the world.
The winter wind swept across the fields of Normandy, rattling the shutters of the Moreau cottage. The hour was late, but the house had not known sleep for many nights. Shadows swayed on the walls where a single oil lamp burned, casting its weak glow over the narrow room. On the bed near the window lay Clara Moreau, 22 years old and pale as linen. Each breath she drew was a struggle, shallow and wheezing, broken by fits of coughing that shook her frail body. A stained handkerchief slipped from her hand, falling to the floor. The crimson blot at its center was stark, vivid against the white fabric. Blood again. Pierre saw it, though Clara tried to push it aside with trembling fingers. He clenched his jaw. "Enough," he muttered under his breath, picking up the cloth. His hands were calloused, scarred by years of labor at the workshop. But tonight they trembled. He had faced storms, broken timber, even the deaths of animals on the farm. But the sight of his sister fading was more than he could endure. Outside, the church bell tolled midnight. Its mournful echo carried over the sleeping village, a sound that felt too much like a funeral warning. The physician had been clear earlier that day. There was little more to be done. Clara's lungs were failing. Rest, warmth, and prayer, those were his only prescriptions. Pierre had wanted to curse him, to throw the man out for daring to cloak hopelessness in such calm words. But he had held his tongue, for Clara's sake. Now, watching her, the bitter truth pressed down on him. The doctor might be right. Clara stirred, her eyes half opening. They were gray eyes, once lively and filled with laughter, now dimmed but not extinguished. She tried to speak, but the words broke into another cough, flecks of red staining her lips. Pierre rushed to steady her, propping her against the pillows. "I'm fine," she whispered, her voice no louder than the creak of the floorboards. "You are not fine," Pierre snapped, harsher than he intended. He hated the fear in his own voice, the weakness it revealed. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind and Clara's uneven breathing. Then, faintly, she smiled. "Pierre, do you remember the stories?" "What stories?" "The little flower, Saint Thérèse." Pierre groaned, rubbing his forehead. "Oh, not that again! Clara, listen to me. Stories won't save you. Roses and saints, they are for children. What you need is—" He faltered. What could he say? Medicine? A miracle of science? None of it was within reach.
Clara's gaze turned toward the window. The glass was fogged by frost, but beyond it she imagined the gardens of Lisieux she had once read about, the roses that bloomed even in hardship, tended by the Carmelite nun who died so young yet promised so much. "After my death, I will let fall a shower of roses." Clara had repeated those words to herself in the long nights, a fragile thread of hope when all else failed. Another spasm of coughing seized her, bending her double. Pierre held her until it passed. When she finally sank back against the pillows, her face was ghostly, drained of all color. The lamp flickered. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Then all went still. Clara closed her eyes. For a moment, Pierre thought she had slipped into unconsciousness, or worse. But then her lips moved, forming a prayer so soft he could barely hear it. He turned away, pacing the room. He could not bear it. He wanted to smash something, to shout at the heavens, to demand why his sister, gentle and innocent, should waste away while the world outside carried on with its cruel indifference. Yet as he paced, the air in the room shifted. A faint fragrance crept into the space, sweet, unmistakable, utterly out of place in the cold of winter. Roses. Pierre froze. He sniffed again, blinking in disbelief. There were no flowers in the house, not in this season, not for months. The cottage garden had long been stripped bare by frost. He turned toward the bed. Clara's eyes were open now, wide and glistening, as if she sensed it too. "I smell it," she whispered. Pierre wanted to deny it, to claim it was imagination born of exhaustion, but the perfume was real, saturating the air. His heart pounded. Then Clara's hand, weak as it was, lifted from the blanket. She opened her palm. There, resting against her skin, lay a single rose petal, velvet red, gleaming in the lamplight. Pierre staggered back, his breath catching. The shutters rattled again under the winter wind, but the fragrance of roses did not fade. Clara clutched the petal to her chest, tears filling her eyes. "She came," she whispered. "The little flower. She came." Pierre shook his head violently, though fear clawed at him. "No, this is impossible. This is madness." But deep within, beneath all his protests, a tremor of something he could not name stirred, something that felt disturbingly like awe. The night had grown colder, yet the room seemed wrapped in an unseen warmth. Outside, snow began to fall over the village. Inside, in the fragile stillness of that hour, one impossible petal had changed everything.
Sleep came to Clara, not as rest, but as surrender. Her body, frail and burning with fever, finally gave way to exhaustion. Yet the moment her eyes closed, she found herself standing, not in the narrow room where the lamp burned low, but upon soft earth, bathed in light. The world around her was a garden, vast and unearthly. The air shimmered with gold, as though dawn had chosen never to fade. Roses stretched endlessly, rows upon rows of scarlet, ivory, and blush pink, their petals open and trembling with dew. Their fragrance was overwhelming, sweet and pure, more alive than any scent she had ever known. Clara lifted her hands, no longer trembling, no longer weak. She touched a bloom beside her, and it felt warm, alive, as if it pulsed with a heartbeat. The petals opened wider at her touch, and a cascade of light spilled from its center. She turned, and the garden shifted with her. At its heart stood a figure. A young woman, clothed in the brown habit of a Carmelite nun, her veil dark against the brilliance around her. Her face was serene, eyes gentle as the calmest sea. She looked neither stern nor distant, but radiant, as though joy itself had taken form. Clara knew, without needing words, who she was. Thérèse, the little flower, the saint she had prayed to in her weakest nights, the one whose promise of roses she had clung to when hope was dust. Clara's knees bent beneath her. Though no weakness held her here, it was reverence, awe, and something else. An ache deep within her heart, the ache of being seen. The nun smiled, and in her hands she held a single rose, crimson and perfect. She stepped closer, the garden shifting silently before her feet. No sound of wind or footsteps broke the stillness, only the hush of eternity. She stopped before Clara and extended the rose. Clara hesitated, her breath catching. She reached out, and as her fingers brushed the petals, the flower dissolved into light. A single petal remained, weightless, soft as a whisper, resting in her palm. The nun's voice did not come through the air, but through Clara's very soul. This is only the beginning. And then, like mist in the morning sun, the garden began to fade. Roses dissolved into brightness, the air dissolved into silence. Clara tried to cling to it, to hold the moment, but the world unraveled swiftly, and she was falling back into darkness.
She woke with a gasp. The cottage ceiling swam into view, the shadows long and thin in the pale gray of dawn. Her chest rose and fell with sharp breaths, the taste of dream still thick on her tongue. She lay motionless for a moment, convinced it had been nothing but fever's trick. Her hand still tingled, though it was empty. The garden, the saint, the words, they must have been fragments of her dying mind. And yet, something brushed her cheek. She turned her head. There, resting against the pillow, was a rose petal. It was no ghostly shimmer, no fading vision. It was real, tangible, velvet to the touch, red as living flame, glistening with a dew that should not exist in the dead of winter. Clara's breath caught. Tears filled her eyes. She clutched the petal as though it might vanish if she let go. The door creaked. Pierre stepped in, carrying a basin of water. His eyes, hollow from sleeplessness, widened when he saw her awake, sitting upright. "What is it?" he asked. Clara opened her hand, showing him the petal. Her lips trembled. "She came," she whispered. Pierre frowned. He set the basin down too hard, water sloshing over the edge. "Clara, no! Don't do this to yourself. Fever dreams, that's all. You—" "She placed it in my hand," Clara whispered. Pierre shook his head violently. "Enough! The sickness is twisting your mind." He strode forward, snatched the petal, and held it to the light. It did not fade. It did not crumble. It was a rose petal, unmistakably alive, fragrant, and impossible. He stared at it for a long moment, his knuckles white. Then he hurled it onto the table as though it burned him. "It means nothing, nothing but madness." But the words rang hollow. The fragrance lingered in the air, undeniable. Clara reached for the petal again, her hands trembling, not from weakness, but from awe. "It means everything," she murmured. Pierre turned away, his shoulders rigid, unwilling to face the truth that was pressing against the walls of reason. But Clara, her eyes bright despite the fever shadow, pressed the petal to her heart. Outside, the first snow of morning began to fall, veiling the village in white silence. Inside the cottage, a mystery had taken root, fragile as a flower, yet strong enough to crack stone.
The days that followed were strange, heavy with silence yet filled with whispers. Clara's health, once hanging by the thinnest thread, began to change. Her breathing, though still shallow, steadied. Her coughs came less often, and when they did, the blood no longer stained her lips as darkly. She could sit upright for longer, even walk a few steps to the chair near the window. It was nothing the doctor could have explained, though he was summoned once again to examine her. He frowned, tapping his pen against the edge of his notebook, muttering about unexpected resilience and temporary improvement. He refused to speak of miracles. Doctors seldom do. But Pierre, who had watched Clara with the eyes of despair for weeks, could not deny that something had shifted. He would not name it, but he saw it. Still, the petal remained on the bedside table, fresh as the morning it had appeared, not withered, not browned by air or time, but alive, fragrant. Clara guarded it like treasure.
Pierre tried not to look at it, though it burned in the corner of his vision whenever he entered the room. Outside the cottage, the world took notice. It began with a single neighbor, an old woman who claimed she had smelled roses as she passed by the Moreau house one frost-laden morning. She told another, and by evening the story had grown. Clara Moreau, the dying girl, has seen the little flower herself. Lisieux was not far, and the memory of Thérèse was still alive in the hearts of the faithful. She had been a young nun, simple and hidden, yet her words, her promise of roses, had spread like fire since her death. Many believed, many doubted, but all were fascinated. Soon villagers came under various excuses, to lend food, to ask after Clara's health, to bring broth or firewood. Their eyes always lingered, searching for signs, whispers of petals, scents, visions. Clara smiled softly, grateful for their kindness, but she kept her secret close, unwilling to cheapen it with too many words. One afternoon, as snow fell in a slow veil over the fields, Sister Marie visited. She was a stout, elderly Carmelite who had known hardship all her life, yet carried with her a peace that seemed unshaken by storms. She sat beside Clara's bed, her hands folded, eyes warm. "I have heard," she said quietly, "that roses have bloomed where none should be." Clara lowered her gaze, fingers brushing the petal on her table. Sister Marie leaned closer. "Do not be afraid, child. When the Lord sends his signs, they are not given to frighten, but to strengthen. Thérèse promised she would send roses as her sign. Perhaps you have been chosen to receive them." Pierre, who lingered in the doorway, scoffed under his breath. "Or perhaps it's all imagination. People see what they want to see." The nun turned to him, her eyes kind yet piercing. "And what is it you want to see, young man? Only what the world can measure? Or do you dare to look at what cannot be explained?" Pierre had no answer. He left the room muttering about chores, but the words clung to him like thorns.
That night, Clara dreamed again, though less vividly than before. She saw fragments, a rose bush trembling in wind, drops of dew like tiny stars, a voice urging her not to be afraid. She woke before dawn, her chest lighter, her mind steady. Word continued to spread. Soon Father André, the parish priest, came to call. His presence filled the room with the scent of old books and candle wax, his black cassock dusted with snow. He spoke with Clara gently, asked her to recount what she had seen. She told him the truth, simple and unembellished. The garden, the nun, the petal that had not faded. The priest listened intently, nodding. "There are others," he said at last, "in this parish, in nearby towns. Since the passing of Thérèse, strange things have been told. A woman healed of fever after roses appeared on her windowsill. A child lost in the woods who followed the fragrance of roses until he was found. Many doubt, some mock, but the stories do not cease." Clara's heart stirred. She was not alone. The petals, the scent, the dream, they were part of something greater, something that stretched beyond her small cottage and her failing body. Still, Pierre grew restless. Each visitor, each whisper, seemed to tighten the walls around him. He had worked hard all his life, his hands carving wood and stone, building what was real, what was solid. And yet here was his sister, frail as a reed, outliving the expectations of physicians, guarded by a rose that would not wither. He feared it, not for her sake, but for his own. For if it were true, then the world was not as he had believed, and that terrified him. One evening, The cottage filled with villagers again, gathered for prayer. Candles flickered, casting halos of light against the beams. Clara, propped on pillows, whispered prayers along with them, her voice weak but clear. The rose petal lay upon the table, a silent witness. As the prayers ended, the air thickened with the familiar sweetness. Several gasped, hands clutching rosaries. From somewhere unseen, another petal drifted down, landing at Clara's feet. The villagers crossed themselves, murmuring. One woman began to weep. Pierre stood frozen. He wanted to deny it, to call it trickery, but he had seen it with his own eyes. A petal, red and fresh, lying where no hand had placed it. The whispers grew louder in the village after that night. Clara Moreau's name passed from lips to lips, from hearth to hearth. Some spoke of holiness, others of hysteria, but all spoke. And Clara, lying in her bed, felt both small and immense, a fragile girl touched by something infinite. Yet, in the shadows, Pierre's unease deepened. For every petal that fell, for every prayer that was whispered, he felt a storm gathering, not in the sky, but in his heart. The petals brought peace to Clara, but to Pierre, they brought a question that no answer could soothe.
The first days of January arrived with a biting cold that pierced even the thickest walls. Snow lay heavy on the rooftops, muffling the village in silence, while smoke curled from chimneys in fragile threads. Life slowed in the frost, yet inside the Moreau household, the whispers of roses did not cease. Clara grew stronger, though still pale. She could stand longer, eat a little more, and her laughter, light, hesitant, sometimes drifted through the house, startling Pierre as if he had heard the voice of a ghost. Each sound of her recovery only deepened his unease. For how could this be, when weeks ago death had already sharpened its sickle over her bed? Pierre buried himself in work, retreating to his workshop at the edge of the cottage. There, surrounded by sawdust and wood shavings, he sought the comfort of the tangible. His hands carved beams, planed planks, shaped reality into firm lines. Unlike roses that appeared without reason, unlike petals that refused to die, wood obeyed him. Hammer and chisel gave him certainty. But even the workshop was not safe from his unrest. Villagers knocked on his door, asking questions, bringing rosaries for Clara to touch, begging to see the miraculous petal. Pierre dismissed them gruffly, his voice harsh with impatience. "Leave us in peace," he said, though peace was the last thing he felt. One evening, as dusk bled into the horizon, Pierre climbed a ladder to fix a beam loosened by snow. The workshop groaned under the weight of winter. He worked quickly, axe and mallet in hand, his breath fogging in the freezing air. But haste and distraction are treacherous companions. The crack came sudden, a splintering snap that echoed like thunder. The beam above shuddered, then collapsed. Pierre had only a heartbeat to register the shadow falling before it crushed down on him. The sound drew villagers rushing, their shouts piercing the night. They found him half buried under the weight of timber, blood seeping from his temple, his body twisted unnaturally. He was alive, barely. They carried him into the cottage, laying him upon the bed opposite Clara's. The doctor was summoned once more. His face, pale in the lamplight, gave no comfort. "The injuries are severe," he said gravely. "His ribs are broken, perhaps puncturing the lung. His head wound,
I do not expect him to last the night." The words struck Clara like a blade. Only weeks ago it was her life that hung by a thread, with Pierre's steady hands caring for her. Now the roles were reversed, and despair clawed at her chest. She pressed the doctor's words into silence and fell to her knees beside her brother's broken body. His breath rattled shallowly, his skin clammy. Blood stained his hair, his lips. His hands, calloused from years of labor, lay limp and unresponsive. Clara grasped them tightly, tears blurring her sight. "Not him, Lord. Take me instead, but not him," she whispered. His trembling voice, yet deep within, a fire stirred. She remembered the garden, the voice, the promise. This is only the beginning. She looked at the petal, still resting in its place by her bedside, untarnished, shining faintly in the lamplight. With all her remaining strength, she lifted it and pressed it against Pierre's chest.
"Saint Thérèse," she prayed aloud, her voice breaking, "you who promised roses, who said you would let fall a shower of them from heaven, hear me now. Do not let him die. If roses are truly your sign, then let them fall for him too." Her words echoed into the silence. The villagers, gathered around, bowed their heads, their murmured prayers rising like incense. The room was thick with grief, yet threaded with a strange expectancy. Then it came, the fragrance. Subtle at first, like a whisper of spring through winter's grasp, then stronger, flooding the cottage, sweet and undeniable. Some gasped, some sobbed. A woman clutched her rosary so tightly it left marks on her skin. From the rafters above, something stirred. A single petal drifted down, landing on Pierre's brow. Another followed, and then another. Soon, petals rained softly, impossibly, filling the air, settling upon his chest, his hands, the bed. It was as if heaven itself had opened, scattering roses where no roses could be. Clara's tears fell on his hand as she cried out, "Merci, merci!" The room trembled with awe. Children knelt, women crossed themselves, men wiped their eyes roughly, unable to hide what they felt. And then Pierre stirred. A cough tore from his throat, wet and ragged, but alive. His fingers twitched against Clara's palm. Slowly his eyes flickered open, clouded and dazed, but seeing. The doctor, pale as parchment, pressed his ear to Pierre's chest. He stepped back, unable to form words. At last he managed, "His heart. It grows stronger. This should not be possible." But it was. Pierre's lips parted, a hoarse whisper escaping. "Clara!" She collapsed against him, sobbing with joy, clutching his hand to her cheek. The villagers, overcome, fell into prayer, their voices rising in unison. "Little flower, thank you! Merci, Thérèse!" The petals lay everywhere, on the bed, the floor, the windowsill. Their fragrance lingered like the breath of eternity. And in the center of it all, Clara knew beyond doubt the roses had chosen not only her, but Pierre. Yet as the night deepened and the prayers continued, Pierre lay awake in silence, his body fragile, his mind reeling. He had touched death, felt the weight of timber crushing him, the darkness pulling him down. He had seen nothing, heard nothing, and yet now he breathed, covered in roses, alive against all reason. For Clara, it was salvation. For him, it was terror. Because to deny what had happened would mean denying his very breath, and to accept it would mean surrendering the world he had built around certainty, logic, and stone. The trial had only begun.
The village of Lisieux had never seen such a night. Word of the miracle spread like wildfire.
Even before dawn, villagers crowded outside the Moreau cottage, their breath visible in the freezing air, their eyes wide with expectation. Some carried candles, others rosaries, some simply their bare hands clasped in prayer. They waited, whispering, as though heaven itself had chosen their tiny corner of the world to open its gates. Inside, Clara drifted between exhaustion and radiant joy. Her brother still lay weak, but the death rattle was gone from his breathing. His chest rose and fell, steady, fragile, yet alive. Each time she glanced at him, gratitude bloomed anew in her heart, brighter than the ache of her tears. But Pierre did not share her peace. Though his body had escaped death, his mind was torn-tossed. He stared at the ceiling, at the scattered petals that covered his bed and floor, their fragrance clinging to him like a haunting. He clenched one in his fist, crushed it, expecting it to wither, to prove itself false. Yet, when he opened his palm, the petal lay unharmed, vibrant as though freshly plucked. "Why?" he whispered hoarsely, though no one answered. By morning, the priest of the parish arrived, a gentle, aged man named Father Antoine. He stepped into the cottage with solemn reverence, his boots shedding snow at the door. At once he smelled the roses, saw the petals strewn everywhere, and bowed his head. "It is as she promised," he murmured. "The little flower showers her roses." He turned to Pierre, who watched him with hollow eyes. "You have been touched by a grace few men ever see. Do you understand what has been given to you?" Pierre shook his head, bitterness cutting his voice. "I understand nothing. I should be dead, Father. I felt it. I saw nothing. No light, no angel, no Christ. Only darkness. And then this." He gestured weakly at the petals, his hand trembling. "If this is God, he is cruel to mock me so." Father Antoine studied him kindly, but firmly. "It is not mockery, my son. It is mercy. The rose does not need you to believe in order to bloom. It simply blooms because heaven willed it so. Do not demand signs according to your reason. Accept the gift as it is." Pierre turned his face away, yet deep inside, the priest's words struck a wound he could not close. That night, Clara dreamed again. She stood once more in the luminous garden, roses shining as though lit from within. The Carmelite nun awaited her, her eyes calm as the sea at dawn. "You prayed for your brother," the nun said, her voice like soft bells, "and heaven has answered. But his heart is still bound in chains of doubt. It is not enough that he lives, he must also see." Clara's voice shook. "How can he see if he refuses?" The nun placed a rose into her hands. "Suffer with him. Love him. Pray without ceasing. In time, the roses will fall not only on his body, but into his soul." When Clara awoke, the rose lay on her pillow. Days passed, and Pierre's strength returned. He walked slowly with a cane, his breath shallow but steady. The villagers greeted him with reverence, some even reaching to touch the sleeve of his coat as though he carried holiness. Yet he brushed them off, his face set hard. But at night, he was not so strong. He woke drenched in sweat, haunted by the sound of wood splintering, the crush of beams, the suffocating darkness. Each time, he found Clara praying beside him, her rosary worn thin between her fingers. She never reproached him, never pressed her faith upon him, only prayed, quietly, with a steadfastness that pierced him more than words ever could. One evening, as snow fell thick outside, Pierre sat alone by the hearth. Clara slept lightly nearby. The cottage was silent, save for the crackle of the fire. He leaned forward, resting his head in his hands. "Saint Thérèse," he whispered at last, his voice hoarse with desperation, "if you are real, if this was your doing, then show me, not with petals, not with fragrances, but with something my heart cannot deny. I do not want riddles, I want truth." At that moment, a gust of wind blew open the shutters. The fire flickered wildly, and the air filled again with the fragrance of roses,
so strong it was almost suffocating. Pierre staggered to his feet, his heart racing. Then he saw it. From the open window, petals poured, not drifting lazily, but in torrents, a shower of crimson and white cascading as though heaven itself had split. They swirled around him, covering the floor, clinging to his clothes, his hair, his face. The cottage became a sea of roses, their fragrance overwhelming, their beauty undeniable. Pierre fell to his knees, his breath breaking into sobs he had not shed since childhood. "Clara!" he cried, awakening his sister. She gasped at the sight, petals raining in impossible abundance, filling the room like waves. Pierre buried his face in his hands, tears streaming freely. "I believe," he whispered, voice shattering. "My God, I believe. Forgive me." Clara crawled to his side, wrapping her frail arms around him. Together they knelt amid the roses, their tears mingling with the petals. Outside, villagers who had gathered again saw the miracle through the glowing windows. They fell to their knees in the snow, lifting their voices in prayer, the sound rising like a hymn into the night sky. And above them, unseen, a young Carmelite nun smiled, her arms full of roses. The rain of roses had at last come.
Spring came early that year, as though the earth itself wished to echo heaven's generosity. Snow melted into rivulets, birds returned with their songs, and fields awoke in green. For Clara, every sunrise felt like a gift borrowed from eternity. For Pierre, each dawn was a silent battle between doubt and surrender. But the petals remained. Days after the miraculous storm, roses still appeared, on the windowsill, at the threshold, even on Pierre's workbench. They came with no roots, no stems, only in perfection, as if plucked directly from paradise. And each time, Pierre felt the same trembling within, awe wrapped in fear, faith wrestling with reason. It was Father Antoine who finally spoke. "You must go to Lisieux, go to the Carmel where Thérèse rests. Carry the petals with you and give thanks at her tomb. What began here must be laid at her feet." And so, with villagers bidding them farewell, Clara and Pierre set out. She, fragile yet radiant, held a small box where the petals lay, still unfaded. He, leaning on his cane, walked beside her, his steps slow but steady, his heart heavy yet drawn forward. The road was long, winding through fields and forests, but something in the air seemed to guide them. Travelers they met whispered blessings. At night, when the stars spread vast above, Clara prayed softly, and Pierre listened in silence, no longer turning away. At last, the spires of Lisieux rose against the sky. Bells rang from the Carmel as if in welcome. The siblings entered quietly, their steps echoing in the hush of stone corridors. And when they reached the tomb of Thérèse, Clara knelt and placed the box of roses there. The fragrance filled the chapel instantly. Pierre's knees gave way, and for the first time he bent beside his sister, his lips trembling not with defiance, but with prayer. No petals fell that day. None were needed, for the greatest miracle had already taken root, not in their hands, but in their hearts.